Hello, everyone. So this is the first of my short lectures that cover some of the kind of main ideas of each of Eric Foner's chapters in Give Me Liberty, and also add some kind of local examples or stories that help us make connections between that kind of broad historical material and some individual stories that kind of connect to the place where we live. So what and I'm going to upload one of these every week so that you can see, and I'd like you to watch these, take some notes, and then you will complete a short, answer a short question that's called the lecture discussion response. So now I'm going to share my screen with you, and so that you can see the PowerPoint. All right, so today we are talking about the Reconstruction era. And I put the title slide with this particular monument, partly because I know that we will be talking about monuments quite a bit this week. And this is a monument that is in Washington, D.C., and it is called a Monument to the Emancipation Proclamation. It became fairly actually controversial. It was the funds that were raised by a lot of the people that contributed to this monument were formerly enslaved people. But the board that decided the design of the monument was all white. And so when this was unveiled, there were a number of Black Americans, including Frederick Douglass, who objected to this monument. And if you look at it here, take a moment to guess why you might have objected. So, the main thing that Frederick Douglass objected to in this monument was that it portrays President Lincoln kind of towering over an enslaved Black American in a way that seemed sort of paternalistic, and also isn't really what he saw as an adequate representation of freedom. This instead was another kind of vision of kind of white control. Now, I do not know what the intentions of the monument designer are, but I can tell you a little bit more about this. So Lincoln is standing above this person. He is holding the paper that had the text of the Emancipation Proclamation, which, as you all probably know, he did give that speech in 1863, and it was that statement that really declared that finally kind of recognized that the Civil War was a war about ending slavery. And the Emancipation Proclamation made it very clear that as the war was ending, and at this point the Union was kind of slowly starting to kind of take control, that enslaved people would be freed and slavery would become illegal. So it is a tremendously important document, and Lincoln is beloved by many formerly enslaved people for making that statement. But there are other aspects of this that are somewhat troubling, and one is that the enslaved person represented here is still kind of in a kneeling position. So he still seems kind of, sort of submissive. He's not wearing very much in terms of clothing. And so that also kind of suggested, particularly for a 19th century audience, something about whether or not he would be kind of adequately, quote unquote, civilized and kind of ready for full citizenship. And also you can see the the chains that he has, one is kind of broken, the fist that's sort of starting to come up, but the other one is still in place. And so it does suggest, which of course was true in 1863, that he was not fully emancipated at that moment. A little side note about the person who actually posed for this monument. He actually had been enslaved at one point, and he had managed to escape and get under the protection of a white Quaker who kind of suggested that he be a person to pose for this, but because he was actually in one of the so-called border states of Missouri, the Emancipation Proclamation technically did not apply to him. Those were the border states that Lincoln actually did not say, would necessarily have emancipation of slavery. And that was because Lincoln was worried that if he did that, that those border states would actually also leave and join the Confederacy. They, at that point, were still loyal to the Union. So it gives you some sense of the kind of complications and the politics behind this process of ensuring an end to slavery in this country. So one of the themes in this chapter that I want you to really take note of is the different meanings of Reconstruction, and I want to know how this changes in terms of the historiography over time. The version that you're reading in this textbook, really a lot of it really does come from Eric Foner's work himself. He is one of the kind of premier historians of this era. And one of the reasons he's so well known is that he changed the way the history of Reconstruction had been kind of put in a lot of textbooks. So a lot of textbooks before that when they talked about Reconstruction, they talked about it as, in many ways, a kind of series of failures. And that, the nation wasn't really ready for a lot of the changes that they were trying to initiate after the end of the Civil War. And that was from a kind of white Southern perspective, Reconstruction was this kind of invading Northern force that came in and sort of overtook local control. But there was very little talk in a lot of those early accounts of Reconstruction about the meaning of Reconstruction to Black Americans and how, for them, of course, the Civil War was always about ending slavery and about the remarkable ways that the African American community in various parts of the United States advocated for their own liberation, and the remarkable ability they had to create their own institutions and rise to levels of kind of leadership that were sort of unprecedented. And Foner, at the very beginning of the chapter, noticed that he begins with this meeting of Black ministers talking to General Sherman about the 40 acres and a mule, what later became the 40 acres and a mule kind of policy. And I'll talk about the significance of that in a second. But note here that for Black Americans, these were some of their main goals. They wanted all of the rights of full citizens, the right to vote, the right to a fair trial, all of the other kind of civil rights that we recognize today. They wanted the right to travel across state lines, and they wanted to. A lot of them were already married, but those marriages were not legally recognized. They had been separated from children, from siblings, from other family members, so they wanted to travel to reunite their families after the plantation system was taken apart. And they wanted to establish their own organizations and institutions, their own schools, their own churches, their own political organizations. And they were remarkably effective in doing so during the Reconstruction era. The one area that they struggled with the most was over the owning land. And in the 19th century, that was particularly important because, land ownership was kind of the key to economic independence. If you had your own land that you could farm, you were much more able to adequately provide for yourself and for your family. And people who had been enslaved in these large plantations, understandably, wanted to own parcels of that land themselves. So they advocated what they were calling for Sherman to do and for others to do was to recognize that their labor and how their labor had contributed, had really been the basis of the prosperity of the South. And they wanted those plantations to be divided up into parcels that they could own themselves. But ultimately, the U.S. government was not did not support redistributing land to formerly enslaved people. And because of that, there was this kind of general economic burden that it was very difficult for a lot of freed people to uh, come out of after the Civil War. So just to give the other thing to keep in mind about Reconstruction is just kind of a basic chronology. You have these two periods, and one of them is called presidential Reconstruction. And the very first part is kind of in right at the last part of the Civil War under President Lincoln. That's when you get the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which officially abolishes slavery. That's passed right at the close of the war. And you have an agency called the Freedmen's Bureau that's established. And the book talks about that agency and how ambitious it was. The idea was that this would be the agency that would serve the needs of freed people by kind of settling disputes, about making sure they were paid for their labor, of offering them resources, helping them build schools, lots and lots of things. It was always underfunded and understaffed. It was an incredibly difficult agency, and it didn't ever, unfortunately, get very much support from the white populations, definitely not in the South, but not even in the North. And so it struggled quite a bit, but as Foner notes in the text, it did manage to help establish a number of schools and did some remarkable things. And the people who worked for the Freedmen's Bureau were very dedicated to advocating for Black Americans during that time. So 1865, President Lincoln is assassinated. Vice President Andrew Johnson comes and takes over. And as the book says, Andrew Johnson was he did not like the planter class of the South, but he also was very much a white supremacist. And so his version of Reconstruction was very lenient to white Southerners. He issued lots of pardons to former Confederate officers. He restored land, some of the land that had been redistributed. He took that back and gave it back to white planters. And while Southern states started to enact new laws called the Black Codes, which severely restricted African Americans' freedoms, he, sort of let that happen. So what a lot of white Southern governments were trying to do at that point was in some ways kind of restore the conditions of slavery and restore white supremacy, even if slavery itself was not legal. In the textbook, pay attention to the ways that the textbook talks about how that happened. But for the Republican Party, which was kind of divided, between what they call moderates and radicals, moderates, didn't, as the name implies, they wanted kind of gradual change, and they wanted a kind of quick integration of the South. But radicals were really, really alarmed about what they saw happening in the South after the war, and they said we need more. We need to intervene more directly to make sure that that formerly enslaved people are able to become full citizens. And there are several things that happen where they start to gradually kind of take control of Reconstruction of this era. The Civil Rights Act is one of the earliest, and one of the most important things to note is that this is kind of the origin of the idea of civil rights. And it was a response to the Black Codes. It was a way of saying, no, all of those laws that are being, created in the southern states are not legitimate. They violate individual civil rights. And it also became a precedent for the 14th Amendment, which explicitly, noted equal protection and rights to due process. The 14th Amendment becomes, I would say, one of the most important amendments to the Constitution. And so that also kind of sets this precedent that lots of civil rights advocacy that follows will recall the 14th Amendment as the basis of. And Johnson himself as president is becoming more and more unpopular. And when he, fires cabinet officials, that Congress begins the process of impeaching him. And that weakens him enough that we move on to what we call radical Reconstruction, which was a more forceful kind of intervention into and kind of forcing the former southern states to make bigger changes, more fundamental changes in order to secure African American rights. So the 14th Amendment gets established 1868. And in order for southern states to return to the Union officially, they had to agree to ratify that. And also the 15th Amendment, 1870, is what secures the right to vote for African American men. So those two vital amendments to remember as one of the most important legacies of the Reconstruction era. The other thing that happens are what they call the Reconstruction Acts. And that is probably the prime example of how this was a much more forceful kind of intervention into Southern affairs. They actually divided the South into military districts. So they weren't divided along state lines. It was these 5 districts, and they had to meet these conditions and had to rewrite their constitutions, their state constitutions. And once they did that, then they could apply for readmission to the Union. And so there are also stricter punishments on former Confederate officials. And so all of these things really said that the federal government was really taking seriously the rights of African Americans. And the way the other thing to note before I get into what's actually on this slide here is that it was so important for African American leaders throughout the South to start taking on positions of leadership. So note in the chapter how many, there were Black legislators, there was at least one Black governor. All of this, of course, was new. And so suddenly in a lot of states where you of course had a large Black population that of course never had any kind of rights, even if they had not been enslaved, they often could not vote. They didn't have the full rights of citizenship. But now, because the federal government was advocating for this and had created these new amendments and these new laws that gave them protections at the polls and every other site, they started to win offices, because Black Americans had voting rights and could advocate for themselves and could build their own institutions. And so we see lots of examples, and the textbook has some great examples from other parts of the country, but I wanted to highlight how that happened here in Austin, or one of the leaders of Austin. And it's also really great that, so I know we're not in person, at the Highland campus, but right there, right close to the ACC Highland campus is a street that is named for Jacob Fontaine. And right next there you can see Jacob Fontaine Plaza Park. So if you're going to ACC for any other reason, I encourage you to drive past there. I know there's some construction around there and stuff, but but just drive past that plaza. It's lovely and it's brand new. And it's dedicated to a Black leader in Austin, one of the most remarkable Black Austinites in our history. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit about him. This is not the only place where he's honored. There's a plaque to him in Oakwood Cemetery and some of the churches that he founded. He was a very, very accomplished quite a bit in his long life. And I'll tell you just a little bit here. So he was born in Arkansas, estimated in 1808, and he was enslaved. So um, his grandson helped write a narrative of Reverend Fontaine's life, and that's where we get. And he worked with a journalist, and they published it. It's actually in the Austin History Center. If you want to look up, the life of Jacob Fontaine, you can find that book there. And based on that, this is how we know what we know about his life. But as with many enslaved people, you don't often have lots of specific legal records of their birth or names or where they were enslaved. You have to kind of, it's a challenge to piece that together sometimes. But this is what is known, is that he was born in Arkansas as an enslaved person. And then we know that he arrived to Austin because he was enslaved by a Reverend Edward Fontaine, who actually happened to be the first rector. A rector is sort of like the head priest, the head minister of Episcopal churches. Edward Fontaine became the rector of St. David's Episcopal Church, which is downtown, actually happens to be my church. And that's how I kind of came across more about Jacob Fontaine's story. So, and he's in the St. David's histories and recorded there the stories of who they called Jake. And later we said this was actually became Jacob Fontaine. Even while he was enslaved by Edward Fontaine in Austin, he would preach in the basement of the Methodist Church at Brazos and 10th. And 1860, he starts to attend the First Baptist Church. And he stays in Austin through the Civil War. And then, of course, is liberated at the end of the Civil War. And he's already been in the process of forming a separate Baptist congregation of Black Austinites. This was something that was really important to a lot of African Americans. Was, they recognized that, unfortunately, in the white church, they were certainly not treated as social equals, and they didn't really expect to be. And so they knew they needed to form their own separate Black churches. And these were key, community spaces of African American leadership. So he starts to do this in Austin and becomes one of the foremost Black ministers to create Baptist churches throughout the Austin area. So the first one he formed was called the first, and colored was kind of the traditional term at that time. It's not a term we use today, but that's the term that was kind of widely used at the time, not considered derogatory at the time. That was founded in Austin, 1867. You can see that plaque there refers to it and to Jacob Fontaine's work. While he was doing this, of course, he still had to make a living. Keep in mind that when he was liberated in 1865, he was already 57 years old. So all of this work that he did during the Reconstruction and past the Reconstruction era was well into his 60s and 70s. So it was really remarkable for that as well. So for a time, he worked as a janitor at the land grants office. His family also operated a grocery and a laundry. He owned a book and medicine store. He became active in politics, and he started to form what was called they were called the kind of colored conventions. What they were meetings of prominent Black leaders, and they would issue statements to Texas legislators to try to encourage them to, advocate particularly for access to education, but other kinds of resources and support for the Black community in Texas. And in 1876, he established a newspaper called the Gold Dollar, and this is the first newspaper under Black ownership in Austin, one of the first in the entire South. And those newspapers, the Black press, was really, really important because the white press, there was a lot that they would not cover. There was a lot of things impacting the African American communities that the white press was not calling any attention to. And so the Black press was a key site of kind of gaining information. In the early years, the Gold Dollar actually, it helps kind of reunite some families. You know, you've got people who had been separated under slavery, and so they would put ads for, you know, have you seen this person, to try to reunite with family members that they had been separated from. And Fontaine himself called this the Gold Dollar because his sister had given him a gold dollar, and he had been reunited with his sister after over 20 years of being separated under slavery. So so that publication, and there are a few copies that are in local archives here as well. You can see some remnants of that, but that was a really, really important institution as well. And then here you can see kind of a map of other churches that he established from 1867 to 1887. You've got Baptist churches in Round Rock, Wheatsville, Clarksville, Williamson Creek. All of these he helped establish during his life. And then he also became this leading advocate for the establishment of the University of Texas at Austin. At the time, he was advocating for it because he wanted Black Americans to have access to college education. He could not have realized that that when UT was finally established, that it would not allow Black Texans to be students. That would, of course, not happen until much later. And you would have to have separate universities. Eventually, you've got, of course, Houston-Tillotson University, which gets established for African Americans, still a very prominent college here in the Austin area. But Fontaine is not specifically connected to that particular institution, but he was definitely known as one of the key advocates for educational institutions and for churches in Austin. And so what I want you to note about his life is that, like so many other Black leaders at this time, his life really exemplifies all of those goals that I talked about earlier about reuniting families. You know, he helped reunite his own family. He helped reunite other families. As a minister, when he would marry people, there were lots of of statements in the papers about marriages. Well, often these marriages were marriages that actually existed before, but now they could finally be legalized. So in that way, he was also kind of formalizing family ties. Political advocacy, creating separate institutions, you know, all of these things are things that Jacob Fontaine did. And he was fortunate, of course, to live a long life. He didn't die until 1898, so he died about 90 years old. And so, you know, but most of that, of course, was done after he was in his mid 50s. So in his later life, he did a remarkable amount of wonderful work for Austin's Black community, and that's why he's quite beloved here for that. All right, so this last part, unfortunately, we have to talk about the demise of Reconstruction and why this remarkable era did not last longer. And it really had to do a lot with Southern white backlash. And also, I'll note Northern white ambivalence. So Southern whites, unfortunately, they responded to to the rise of Black leaders with racial violence. And the Ku Klux Klan emerges as a terrorist organization in 1866, and it lynches, it murders, it harasses, they bomb houses, all through the Reconstruction era, and they targeted African Americans the most. They also targeted any white Republicans who allied with them, and so they inflicted racial terror on in throughout the South. Eventually, there are these acts. The KKK Act of 1871 starts to set some new penalties, and they do become more effective at addressing, Klan violence, but it doesn't stem it entirely. And other kinds of the Freedmen's Bureau was chronically underfunded, as I said before, and so by 1877, a number of white Americans and are thinking that, we can't afford to continue to intervene and invest these economic resources into the South anymore. So Southerners need to kind of take care of their own problems. And so unfortunately, Northern whites were increasingly tired of kind of paying the economic costs of Reconstruction, and they weren't particularly interested in advocating for Black civil rights. Keep in mind that there was a lot of racism in the North as well, and so all of those sentiments unfortunately led to the demise of these policies under Reconstruction. So 1876, you have a very controversial presidential election, and the textbook talks about that much more. You essentially have a tie in a very close election where the Democrat actually gets more votes than the Republican, but the Republican has this kind of lead in the Electoral College. That should sound familiar, as we've seen conflicts like that in recent years. And what they decided in 1877 was that, yes, the Republican president would be able to assume the presidency, but Republicans essentially kind of agreed to let go of Reconstruction, to sort of say, okay, we're going to allow the Southerners to have more home rule. And Democrats, particularly Southern Democrats, of course, agreed with this, and that's why they agreed to kind of not contest the election. So that's essentially the compromise of 1877, and that's the real kind of official demise of Reconstruction. You also have a very conservative Supreme Court at the time, and one of the decisions they later, of course, call for is Plessy v. Ferguson, which essentially legalizes segregation. So overall, after 1877, you see this shift toward what Southern whites called redemption, and the redeemers replaced the social control of slavery with the social control of segregation, and you have the birth of Jim Crow. So that's what we will kind of talk about at a later point. But I do want us to just remember how remarkable this era was in what I essentially say is redefining the nation. So this was the first time that the federal government is essentially becoming the protector of individual rights. A lot of the ways that the Constitution had been written and the Bill of Rights had been written had said, like, your civil rights, your individual freedoms are really tied to the state that you live in. It was still kind of looser federation. But after the Civil War, the federal government becomes more powerful and more of an advocate for individual rights for populations within states that might be overpowered. In those states, the federal government comes in as a kind of protector of individual and civil rights. It affirms the idea that citizenship is not really about the state you live in, it's about the country. And it's no longer reserved to white Americans. At the very beginning of our country's history, citizenship was explicitly for white people. It's very clear about that. But at this point, when African Americans are finally incorporated as full citizens, that makes this finally a kind of multiracial democracy for the first time. Now, there are still groups who do not have those rights. Native Americans don't have the rights of full citizenship. Asian Americans are going to have another struggle to access full citizenship as well. So this is not, the struggle is not over by any means at this moment, but it is this important time when there is this opportunity to say that those promises in the Declaration of Independence are coming so much closer to a reality. But that, sometimes we like to think of history as a kind of forward progress. We get more and more rights, more and more freedoms, and that just kind of expands over time for more groups of people. But unfortunately, that is not always the way it happens. And so this is a one kind of hopeful moment in our nation's story, but then we move back and we lose a lot of the kind of progress that we made in the era after Reconstruction. And that's what we'll talk about next week.